Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with another Victober video. This is another in my small series of Victorian recommendations where I'm just trying to give you maybe 5 recommendations on a specific topic. So today we're just going to be talking about long Victorian novels that I truly do think are worth the effort and are worth your time. It was very hard to narrow down this list because it just kind of comes down to what you define as a long book. And for me, it does tend to be anything that's over 500 pages, but in the Victorian period, 500 pages and a little bit over seems to have been pretty much the standard. And so I think the majority of the ones that I am going to be recommending are actually between 650 to 1,000 pages. Okay, one of these is almost 1,000 pages in my edition. A lot of Victorian novels are extremely long because they were serialized. So they were released part by part over months and months and months. And so it might have been years before you got the full complete story, before you actually finished reading a book that was serialized. And I think serialization was both a great and a bad thing. Some books that were serialized, you can really feel it. You can really feel it. Others that were serialized, it feels as though it was just the ideal format for that story. So today I have 5 long Victorian books that I just really wanted to recommend you. I think these are all really wonderful. Some of these are really big, popular recommendations, but I hope that I have a couple here that maybe don't get talked up so much. The first recommendation that I'm going to make is, I think, kind of the iconic long Victorian novel. And a lot of people have this on their bookish bucket list. This is a book that a lot of people really want to tackle in their lifetime. And I think the length is what really holds people off from starting this one. And that is Middlemarch by George Eliot. Now, I am not the world's biggest fan of George Eliot. I'm not going to say that I dislike her writing, but sometimes I just don't get on with her. I have DNF'd more from her than I have finished. But strangely enough, Middlemarch was on my very first Victober TBR, and I actually read it in my very first Victober, which is stunning to me because at that point I had read very little Victorian literature, so I'm not sure what compelled me to put this one on my list for the first Victober. But I did miraculously finish it, and I really enjoyed it. I read this coming off of several more pacey, more plot-heavy Victorian reads, and there was something about the pace of this that was very comforting and that I really enjoyed after having read some very fast-moving books. It really felt great to move into a book that was a little bit slower paced and far more character-driven. Middlemarch also ranks for a lot of people, not just as their favorite Victorian novel, but as just one of the top books they've ever read. I don't think I would say that. I don't know that I have the fondness for it that some other people do. I'm definitely due for a reread of this. But this was a strong 4-star for me. And the length was definitely, to me, what was off-putting about it. The length was what made me a little bit apprehensive about picking this up. But truly, I don't think this felt very long. This is the one that I'm thinking comes in at around 1,000 pages. 900. It comes in at 900 pages in this edition. And I truly don't think it feels like that. There are definitely some tedious parts of it, but to me, there often are in these longer Victorian novels. There comes to be a point about midway through where you start to feel like things are dragging quite a bit. And so that's definitely present here, but to me, it's not nearly as bad as it is in some other Victorian novels. This is just a real delight to read. And I think it's a wonderful springtime read if you want to save it for spring. I mean, Middlemarch just kind of seems ideal to read in March. I know I'm predictable, and I know at this point you're all expecting me to put a Wilkie Collins in these recommendation videos. And I had to, okay? I really did. This is, again, possibly the most obvious recommendation I could give you for Wilkie Collins, but I think it is also the longest book of his that I have read, and that is The Woman in White. This is my favorite Victorian novel. It is around 750, 800 pages, but akin to Middlemarch, it really doesn't feel like its length. In fact, I think this one is very fast moving because of the plot and the mystery elements. And so if you really get into this, the pages are going to fly by. The reading experience is going to be so quick because you're going to want to know what happens next. You're not going to want to put the book down. And that was definitely the experience that I had with it. This was, I think, my first read in my first Victober. And again, it seems like a strange one to have started out my journey with Victorian literature on, but it's so dreamy, it's so much fun. I think of all of the Victorian authors that I love, Wilkie Collins' style is the most modern feeling. I don't think it takes you very much to get into the headspace of his writing. Like sometimes it does for me with George Eliot or even Charles Dickens. It takes a little bit for me to get back into the Victorian mind space. I don't think that I have that issue with Wilkie Collins, and so that really also means that for a long book, this one moves very, very fast because to me, there isn't kind of the added level of trying to understand his language. There's also a bit of a mystery element present in this, which I just think makes this so decadent and fun. And again, adds to the fact that you really want to keep reading this. You don't want to put this book down. And so to me, this is the recommendation of the 5 that I'm going to list here that does not feel like it is very long at all. I think all of the rest of these books have parts in the middle where things start to drag just a little bit. And I don't feel like I ever felt that once in The Woman in White, but it was possibly just because there was a mystery component to the storyline. I'm trying not to be biased here, but this is the book that I would recommend the most of the ones that I'm going to talk about today. I just truly love this book. This is my favorite Victorian novel. When talking about serialization, I think there are a couple of books that the serialization format was just ideal for, and one of those is the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Yes, we could have put any number of Charles Dickens books on a list of recommendations for long Victorian novels, but I have such a fondness for the Pickwick Papers, it's unbelievable to me. It is the book of his that I have thought of the most frequently. I think other than A Tale of Two Cities, this is the book that I think of the most frequently, and I don't know why that is. I really don't, because it doesn't seem as deep or as introspective as his later novels. The Pickwick Papers is actually his first publication. And sometimes I do think you feel that. I think you feel that his writing isn't as polished. But the Pickwick Papers is set up as a series of vignettes and like meeting minutes from the meetings of this group of guys who hangs out with Pickwick. And I think that format meant that serialization worked so well here because there was a clear end to most of these chapters and most of these chunks, but I don't think you feel as though he's putting things in just to intrigue you, to make you want to pick up the next part. That's something that I feel is present in other books that are serialized. I think you're getting bored and then there at the very end of a section, something happens and you're like, oh, I've got to carry on with this because I need to figure out what happens next. But the rest of that part may be very boring. I didn't find that here. In the Pickwick Papers, the Pickwick Papers is very lighthearted and fun. There are some sadder and more tragic moments towards the end and in certain of these little vignettes, little stories that are incorporated throughout the book. But to me, it is possibly the most lighthearted of his novels that I have read. And I think it's a great place to start with Dickens. I really do. Again, basically I could swap in any Dickens here, but I think there's something very charming about this, and I think this one also doesn't necessarily feel as long as it is. This is another that comes in near 1,000 pages, I think, 800. So this one doesn't feel as long as it is because it has those short chapters and those little stories, those little vignettes that you can very easily move through. Even if you just read one of those a day, you feel as though you're making progress, and it also doesn't feel as though you forget anything by the next time that you pick up the book, because some of these chapters are fairly self-contained, or they feel like episodes of a sitcom, you know? So when you next pick up the book, you remember who the characters are and you remember all of their various placements in the plot. And so you're just ready for the next episode of their adventures, which I think makes this a really great recommendation for a long Victorian novel. These last two are books where I do feel like the length was a struggle for me. And that's why I really did want to recommend them as long Victorian novels, because to me, the length of these is what stuck out the most. In the end, I feel like in both of these cases, the length was very justified. One of these is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, and it's taken me a long time with this one. It has really taken me a long time to come back around to this. I think I DNF'd this twice before finishing it and really enjoying it the third time around. So third time is the charm. Vanity Fair is kind of a historical fiction piece that is set during the Napoleonic Wars, and it follows a really terrible main character named Becky Sharp, who I adore. I really love her. The characters are so strong here. This, akin to Middlemarch, has some of the strongest characterization I've seen. And I think this also has a very interesting plot, particularly towards the end. I hate to say this about a book this long, but really, if you can make it into that second half, I think you're in for a treat. William Makepeace Thackeray's writing is very witty and charming, and he's constantly kind of cracking jokes in the narration, which I think is really fun and refreshing, and it reminds me quite a bit of Charles Dickens, and so that's kind of why I wound up really enjoying this. I enjoyed the humor, but there is also, interestingly, what feels like an episodic nature to this as well, because it is following key moments in the Napoleonic Wars, kind of in the lead up to Waterloo. And so it's interesting that you can kind of categorize what is happening in this book based on what is happening in the Napoleonic Wars at the time. This was one of my first exposures to that time period and that war. I'm not very familiar with the Napoleonic Wars. I knew nothing about Napoleon when I read this. And now I know quite a bit about him. And so I kind of want to, I want to come back and reread this because I have a fondness for Napoleon now. But this one definitely feels as though it is long. This is another one that I think is near 1,000 pages. So let's see, 900. It definitely is. But the characters are so charming. Elements of this are really fun. And I really appreciate the historical side of this because I really love Victorian historical fiction. Just absolutely adore it. And so this is one that kind of crept up on me. I didn't think I was going to enjoy it as much as I wound up enjoying it. This is a recommendation where I would say if you were having misgivings early on, that I do think you should stick with it. A lot of people told me that when I DNF'd it the first time, that I needed to come back to it and really stick with it, and I'm so glad that I did. Last but not least is a book I've read this Victober. It was not on my TBR. It kind of came out of nowhere for me, but I really wanted to try a Penny Dreadful this year. This is not one of the more popular Penny Dreadfuls, but I picked up The Necromancer by George W.M. Reynolds. And George Reynolds wrote, most famously, I think, The Mysteries of London, and also Wagner the Werewolf. And Wagner the Werewolf is the one that I was going to pick up, but I heard kind of the plot synopsis of The Necromancer, and I said, that's the one. That's the one I'm trying. And so The Necromancer is set up as kind of a supernatural tale where women have been disappearing when they got involved with this particular family for centuries. This is also historical fiction. It's set during the reign of Henry VIII. And there is kind of an element that you're trying to figure out what happened to these women. The reason that this feels long is that there is a certain amount of repetition involved in it because as a Penny Dreadful, it also was serialized. And so you can definitely tell in this book, in my opinion, where each part ended. And he, as the author, is trying to refresh you on what's going on. So you kind of hear what happened to each individual woman that has been taken by this family. And you know exactly where each of these stories is going. After the first one, you know the formula of these stories, but he tells you all of them anyway. And actually, weirdly enough, those stories are the best part of the book, but his writing is overly wordy as well. I feel like this is one where he's got to have been paid by the word. And I was struggling with this halfway through. I was thinking this could have been 150 pages and this man has made it 700. But when I got to the end, I wound up really enjoying it, and I wound up looking back on the experience very positively and thinking that the length was justified. So this is one that I think is a weaker recommendation. I really don't think everyone is going to get on with this, but In the end, I did. Similar to Vanity Fair, this is one I'm glad I stuck it out with. But this is one that I do think some people will really love because a lot of people really get on with that kind of verbose style that some Victorian authors had. So this one is also a recommendation, but I do think you start to feel its length. So those were just 5 of the long Victorian classics that I think are worth your time. I really think are worth the effort. I would love to know down below if you have read any of these and what your favorite long Victorian classic is. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Happy Victober. Goodbye.